Hi, everyone. So when I was spoken to about coming, I was told there were 3 core focuses: habits, mindset, and network. And I thought to myself, the best way I will be able to explain my view on all 3 and my position on all 3 is actually to tell you a little bit about myself, and then to talk a little bit about negotiation. Because, when you were talking about the one thing, I am the exact opposite of the one thing. I've never, wouldn't be able, other than maybe eat breakfast, maybe that's the one thing for me. But I think it's actually one skill. And for me, negotiation has been the skill that I think has dominated the trajectory of my life. So I was born and raised in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. Yes, that's right. I'll wait until you all applaud. It's fine, I have time. And I lived there until I was 15. When I was 15, I finished high school and I started medical school. Finished medical school when I was 21 and founded an organization called the Voice of Libyan Women. And the purpose of the Voice of Libyan Women, it started in the midst of the Libyan Revolution in 2011. And the purpose was really to ensure that women were included in peace processes. And the reasoning behind it was during the revolution itself, women were incredibly active, they were incredibly engaged, and the second things became a little bit lucrative and powerful, a lot of the women were sidelined. And I found that very frustrating. So who here knows how many peace processes last 5 years? What's the percentage? 2. That's a very low ball, but pretty close, actually. Less than 10%. Less than 10% of peace processes last 5 years. And that's considering, on average, they cost nearly $2 billion to get. And they take 2 to 3 years as a best case scenario. And yet they don't last 5 years. When we include women, what's the likelihood that they will last 5 years? How does that percentage change? 70%? 20%? They are 35 times more likely to last 15 years. Right? Yeah, women, give yourselves a round of applause. No, I'm kidding. But it's actually not the fact that it's women, it's the fact that it's inclusive, right? When you create, and it's the same for any company you have or any business you're in, if the policies are representative of the people there, they're more likely that people will actually adhere to them, right? It's more likely that you'll actually get a lot of the issues at the table if you have the people representing the community at the table. So for me, I went on to Google, and I Googled how to make sure women are part of the peace process. And it told me no one's going to listen to you if you're by yourself. You should create an organization. You need a medium. And so I created an organization. And within about a year, the organization had passed significant laws. Within the next 6 months, our projects had been replicated globally. And I was asked by the Security Council to come and advise them on the global layout and global strategy of 1325, Resolution 1325, which is Women, Peace, and Security. And this is a resolution that specifically focuses on women's inclusion and participation in peace processes. So it's a hyper-specific proposal about how do we actually create more peaceful societies through inclusion, and how do we actually get that inclusion, right? Do we need to start when women are very young? Do we need to start when men are very young? Do we need to, tell militias we're going to talk to the women first and then come back to the militias? What's the actual overall strategy? Within about 6 months, I started helping put together the Sustainable Development Goals. And who here knows what the Sustainable Development Goals are? 2 people? 3 people? Cool. They're like a $3 to $5 trillion a year agenda. Yeah, a lot of your taxpayer dollars go to it, so good job. But the Sustainable Development Goals are 17 goals that 193 countries, including this one, have signed up for. The goals range from everything from no poverty to quality education to sustainable cities, etc., right? And the purpose behind the goals, they really are kind of what drive currently the global agenda in terms of, if you remember, who here remembers the Paris Climate Agreement? That was a Sustainable Development Goal agreement, right? So climate change is one of the core goals and has multiple different goals within it. So I started putting that together and was asked by the UN Secretary General to become one of the 17 advocates. Some of the other advocates included Jack Ma, who's the CEO of Alibaba, Messi, the soccer player, Shakira, the singer, and sorry? Her hips don't lie. But I really hope that gets edited out of the video. Going to get me in trouble with colleagues here. But really the purpose of these 17 people were that they were representative of different parts of the world, different industries, different backgrounds, but they were all focused on the goals. And it was through this process of the Sustainable Development Goals that I began to notice something pretty concrete. Now, how many of you within your businesses either get a wellness bonus or give it, or get it through your insurance? Quite a few. So that was born out of a recognition by several companies because of studies that when employees took time off, when employees went and worked out, when employees got massages, they were more alert at work. And they actually took less sick days. And they actually were more productive, right? So when you cared for the health of your employees, your bottom line was actually much stronger, up to 20% in some companies. It's pretty incredible. And we began to look at health for citizens, right? Everybody kind of knows, or how many people here think the citizen-state trust relationship is deteriorating? Yeah? Yeah? How many people here say that they unequivocally trust the state to act in their best interests? Wow, this is a crowd of Debbie Downers. Usually there's at least one or two that are like, me. Okay, so no Pollyannas here. So the fundamental recognition is that over 60% of us don't trust our government to act in our best interest at all, right? The vast majority of us don't trust the media. The vast majority of us don't trust corporate America. The people we trust most, and this is based on something called the Edelman Trust Survey. So the people we trust most are word of mouth, our friends, right? That's why we're more likely to buy something our friends told us about. We're more likely to vote for somebody our friends have told us about. We're more likely to watch a show when our friends recommend it, right? And so we began to look at this citizen-state trust relationship and what were the two biggest factors within it. And it turned out in countries where citizens trusted the state, they had two services that were assured to them. Can you guess what they are? Healthcare. And what else? Education. It's easy, right? Makes kind of sense. People were assured healthcare and education. That was it. Those were the two basic services. And we were looking at this from a security perspective. I work in security. So our question was, how do we spend less on surveillance and still have the same solutions, still have, a more peaceful status quo? So we began to look a bit more into healthcare and education and what the metric was for it to actually lead to greater citizen-state trust. And with health, we started really looking at what corporates had done, what companies had done for now decades of ensuring healthcare to their citizens. And we started isolating that more and more. And we found that while there is an assumption and a belief in many countries that if you invest in healthcare, it's this black bottomless pit and you're paying for other people's bad habits and yada yada, statistically, it was false. In countries where healthcare was insured and assured for citizens, overall economic growth was much higher. The overall economic growth and the cost per person for healthcare was much lower. A good example here would be the US. So how much does the US spend per person per year on healthcare on average? Close. It's about 10,000. How much does Canada spend? Around 3,000. Canada has assured healthcare, right? It's a pretty incredible difference when you look at it. Because a lot of people argue, well, no, you will pay higher taxes, but in the end, you're actually paying less percentage of your GDP overall. Paying much less, and you would arguably actually end up paying less taxes because more of your GDP would then go to what takes the vast majority of the US GDP, which is security and surveillance and defense, right? So it's a pretty interesting prospect. So the UN Commission on Health, Employment, and Economic Growth was born, which I'm the high-level commissioner for. And the focus there was how do we actually encourage and work with governments that want to create that bridge, that want to be able to lower their healthcare costs, to be able to create longer prosperity in the long term. Because the difference wasn't a one-year difference. This is a 20, 30-year difference. This is the difference between a country's economy being competitive in the long term and not being competitive in the long term. So countries that actually began to provide healthcare in the 1980s and 90s and provide robust healthcare and support were actually the ones that are doing the best now. And Norway's probably the best example for that. So we started looking at how do we do this more organically. And as I'm sure many of you know, there were a lot of naysayers. There always are. And so, as we did with the Sustainable Development Goals, where we had to negotiate it with 193 countries, we had to be able to negotiate this with those same groups. Simultaneously, I was heading something, I currently am the executive director of something called Phase -1. And Phase -1 is a security organization. We focus on security cooperation. The reason I had my cell phone at my wedding was not because I am a selfie queen, but it is because I often get called into active conflict zones and have to actively mediate and negotiate. And so at the time, we were actually working on a very important peace process, the Colombian peace process, and I could not just leave my phone at home in case something happened. So I had pockets built into my wedding dress. And a very understanding husband. But my point here was, in all of these different spaces, when I've really looked at the skill or the habit that's been the most important, it has been negotiation. It's been the ability, I would say the first has been the ability to empathize. I can sit across from genuinely anyone, and I've advised heads of state to sat across from heads of militias, and I can sit across from anybody and empathize with their position. I may not agree with it, but I can recognize that they have a constituency, that they have to actually be leveraged into any position other than the one that exists now. Go right ahead.
Is that your natural behavior, or is that something that you had to work at?
I have 10 brothers and sisters. So I am a stellar master at understanding what really makes people tick. It's a survival skill.
So what advice would you give to people where, like, naturally we're impatient and that empathy doesn't come naturally?
I actually think that's a really good question. I think the way you actually train empathy is it would be, I think, a one thing for a lot of people, right? Training yourself to be more empathetic means you're actively questioning your actions when something is happening. So if you're sitting and having a conversation with somebody and they're telling you something you fundamentally disagree with, and I disagree with almost 80 to 90% of the people I have to work with on a daily basis. So that's probably a low number too. But you actively disagree with, the reason I think having 10 siblings was important is you still have to live with them, right? And so I always still had to be cordial even when disagreeing. So, okay, why do you feel that way? Like, what is it about, for example, women's reproductive rights? Like, what is it that makes you feel that way? And trying to get as much information as you can, because usually where you're going to find common ground isn't on the issue. It's not. It's going to be on the little details where you guys can say, I believe in a fundamental, and this is an example of something that happened last week. Somebody will tell you, I believe in a woman's right, but at the same time, I think, a baby is a fetus, right? A fetus is a baby, and they're a human, etc. And that's their position. And so what we can come to terms with is a fundamental belief in human life, right? We can start there. And we're then starting from a place where we're actually more on the same side than we are from like, no, I completely disagree with you. You're fundamentally wrong. You're, all the words that we use in today's politics. So it's really more about listening than it is about speaking, if that makes sense. And it's honestly a lot about asking questions, which is step number 1 in negotiation. So, but it's about asking questions. Another second part of it is, I think, we all kind of walk into conversations with our own opinions. Everybody does. Your experiences shape your worldview. They shape the conversations you have. They shape how you hear the conversations that you have, right? So somebody could tell you something as simple as, and this is actually, I was at a wedding in England last week, and I said, the weather's great. And he said, there's clouds. It's going to rain soon. And I was like, wow, that's a really pessimistic way of looking at things. And he was like, well, it rained yesterday, and I got stuck outside, and I hadn't even thought that maybe he had been stuck outside for 2 hours while it was raining. None of that. I was just like, this dude's really pessimistic. And so it wasn't until he was like, no, this happened to me yesterday, that I was like, maybe I should have asked, why do you say that? Why is that such a concern first? So part of it is also recognizing that you got to leave your own baggage at home. But yes, another addition to having 10 brothers and sisters, and this will be very important as well, is somebody had asked earlier about how do you know you're asking the right questions. Surround yourself with people who will tell you when you're making mistakes or when you're asking the wrong questions. So I think a lot of us, particularly when it's in our business, and even it's the way that our society works, we naturally select, right? So you'll only see people who have the same political thoughts as you. You'll only see people who have the same social ideas as you. You'll only see... The challenge there is, first off, we don't learn empathy, but we also don't learn how to respectfully disagree at all. I cannot tell you the amount of conversations I've sat in where people will be like, I can't talk to you about this, and just get up and leave. And I think that the inability to surround ourselves with people we might fundamentally disagree with, who can tell us when we're making a mistake, or who can tell us maybe you should read this, actually hinders our ability to negotiate or to understand or to move forward on any issue. You stay very comfortably in your bubble, but you don't really grow. So negotiation has been kind of the key space, this key skill that I've had, but I've also had to work on. And so what I'll do is I'll go through kind of 3 key things in negotiation. How many people here have seen the movie The Negotiator with Samuel L. Jackson? Yeah? There's like 3, 4? Well, there we go. We have a pretty good audience. So my very first thing is something he says beautifully in the film. I actually wish maybe I had brought a clip. But how many of you remember when he's on the phone and he says, don't say no to me. You don't leave me any options. Now I have to shoot the guy. How many of you guys remember this? Yeah? Yeah? Rule number 1 in negotiation, never say no. Never. Even if you fundamentally cannot do it, never say no. Even when you know, you have to kind of tell the person to continue the conversation, ask, how do you expect us to do that? But never say no, because then the door closes. There's no other option, right? So how are we going to do that? And use the royal we or use the royal us. It's always a team effort. But how are we going to do that? Or how do you suppose we can do that? How can we figure that out, right? So we're never saying no. Now, the second one is arguably the most important thing in negotiation. Does anybody know what it is? I kind of gave it away. Anyone? Ask questions. Ask questions. We always start with the why, right? So if somebody is, and this is incredibly important in multi-issue negotiations, but equally so in any negotiation. So it can be from ransom negotiators who we've worked with and trained to people who are working on multi-issue trade deals, right? Always ask why. The vast majority of negotiation, and mentally now picture a negotiation you've had in your own life. Most people picture their partner or their kid, which I think is great. Because I had a mom tell me once, she's like, well, my daughter, she wouldn't do her chores. And I was like, I cannot help you. The only thing I cannot help with is kids. They're unnegotiable. I'm sorry. Once they hit a certain age, but if your kid is under the age of 5, no, they will always win. Those guys are diabolical geniuses. I don't know how to beat them. But most people think of their partner or their business colleague. So think of a negotiation you've had recently or something you've wanted that somebody else has not wanted to give you. Everybody thinking of one? Now, how did you approach that negotiation? Anybody want to volunteer? Did you know you were in a negotiation? No? Yes? Who said yes? So you knew you were in a negotiation. And you didn't?
No, I just was working out a way to get what I wanted.
Yeah. So statistically, over 90% of the negotiations you'll have, you will not know are a formal negotiation. When your wife says, can you pick up the milk? And you say, well, can you grab the dry cleaning? That is, in essence, a negotiation, right? You put the kids to sleep. I'll go wash the dishes. Those are all informal negotiations that we have, right? So that's very common. And usually we enter negotiations with the belief that we are just trying to get what we want out of it. And we very rarely remember that the other person is doing the exact same thing, right? So it's kind of that in military speak, they joke around and call it a zero-sum game, which I personally quite like because I think it actually tells us a lot about how we walk into most relationships. We're not very different in security than we are in our personal lives. Most of us do tend to think, even if we think it's better for the family, we still tend to think of what we would like to contribute before we think about what the other person would like to contribute. It's just it's human nature, in my opinion. So I don't beat myself up too much about it. But step number 1 is know when you're in a negotiation or give courtesy to the fact that the other person doesn't. right? Recognize my husband does not know we're negotiating 100% of the time. Genuinely, he doesn't. Until lately, he's been like, is this a negotiation? But like most of the time, I used to be able to just pull everything over him. And now he's stopped and he's been like, you have to tell me. That's our one deal. We got to at least level the playing field a little bit. You have to tell me when you want something. So give the other person the courtesy of having the chance to get what they want out of it, because then you're more willing to actually have a long-term relationship that works. So this is particularly important in work when you're working with a person regularly and in your personal life. If it's a one-time negotiation, it's important because you want that person to stay there. The reason so many negotiations fail or take 2 to 3 years in a security setting is because people leave. Egos get hurt, they get insulted. The way you keep people there is by allowing for them to also have the privilege and the courtesy of an ask, right? It's not just about you. That's step number 1. So we've said we're never saying no, and then we're asking questions. Why is why the most important question? Why not how are we going to do that, or what are we going to do? Gets to the purpose. Most negotiation is emotionally driven, right? If it's gotten to the point where you're sitting down and you're actually actively negotiating it, it's emotionally driven. Now you can think of the world's biggest negotiations: ego, money, pride, but predominantly ego. It can get to the point where you know financially it's not in your interest and you will continue to negotiate it. My brother is a lawyer, and we were talking about this once. He used to disagree with me all the time because that's what brothers do. And then he started doing divorce law. And he was like, she doesn't even need the house. She's getting way more than him. Why does she want the house? And this was his client. And I was like, because she's mad. It's emotional. And he's like, yeah, but she's got to put the emotions away. She's going to lose everything. And I was like, that's not how negotiation works. Somebody can be the most cool cucumber in front of you. And the fundamental reality is there is a component of that negotiation that will always be about their personal interest. Now, their personal interest can be they have to negotiate this well so that they can get the next job in their ministry, right? Or so they can get promoted. Or it can be something as fundamental as so they can have money. I mean, most militias, it is about power and money. And in your marriage, it can be because, you know what, you won last time, and I get to win this time. Negotiations at their heart are about the why. So why are we sitting here is something you ask yourself. And why is this so important to you is something you ask the other person. And you give them the time and space to answer. We are very bad at listening to listen. We're very good at listening to respond. But you don't get to have an opinion on their why. When you're negotiating, you are not trying to tell them that makes sense or that doesn't. You're simply trying to understand their perspective and where they're coming from. And what's the third most important thing in negotiation? Acknowledgement's important. Sorry? Understand your leverage. So always understand your position, right? How else can we word that? Think about when you negotiate. What do you usually do? Okay. Okay, so everyone's talking about the red line, but how do we actually do that in a negotiation? But how do we do that we're all circling the same drain. Do we give options? I don't know about that. What do we do? Well, I mean, sometimes. We let them go first. You never go first. You never go first in a negotiation. Not in a job salary negotiation, not in a relationship negotiation. You never go first. You never lay your cards. You never tell them what your red line is before you've heard theirs. So a good example of this is a friend of mine was at a job interview, and they asked her, well, what's your usual salary? Like, what is your expected salary? What was your salary at your last job? And this is something that statistically we ask women and minorities more than we ask men, which is quite interesting. And so she turned back to them and said, after reading a wonderful book that I recommend to everybody, turned back to them and said, well, what's your usual range for this position? and immediately didn't have to be the one to dictate the terms. You never want somebody to know what your bottom line is. You never want them to know, because my dad always used to say, if you negotiate for 120%, you might get 80, which is true. You always stack the cards in your favor, and the best way you can do that is by letting the other person go first.
What does that really look like, though, if both sides are skilled and they both know you're not supposed to go first? Somebody has to go first.
How many people do you think are skilled in negotiation? Give me a percentage. Less than 3%. Less than 3% of the people in the world are skilled at negotiation. Negotiation right now is considered one of the top skills. Going into 2030 to 2050, it is considered one of the most important hireable skills. At the UN, we have less than 9% of our negotiating team that we actually deploy. Not that many people actually know how to negotiate. And I would argue a lot less know how to negotiate during an actual negotiation. A lot of people can say really great things at their business school, and then the second they're in the field, they're like, what? No, can you believe this? And then it just falls apart. So the vast majority of mediators and negotiators I've worked with, I've had to be like, reel it in a little bit. Yeah, just reel it in.
What do you do when you know that the person in place of you is an expert negotiator?
That's happened to me a couple of times. I was actually faced with one of the top negotiators in the world during a trade negotiation very recently. And my response to that is recognize it. Say, I've heard of your work. Because a huge part of negotiation is power, right? And so tell them, I've heard of your work. I know you're incredibly great at this, because then you automatically take a lot of power in negotiation, which is that fear, that element of kind of surprise and empathy and trust. You take it away, where you say, I know this is your job. Because then they can't really be like, oh, well, why do you feel it? We'll work on this, us, the royal we. I'll be like, well, no, that's a negotiation tactic. So as much as I can diffuse their power, I do. Now, that's specifically a trade negotiation. My husband has gotten much better at negotiating. Yeah, it's been tough. And I told them a story earlier, actually. So apparently before we got married, I had agreed at some point that my phone would be put away by 6 p.m. every day. I do not remember this. And so literally on our honeymoon, I'm checking my emails because that's what I do. And he looks at me and he's like, no, it's after 6. What are you doing? And I was like, what? No, who made that deal? That's crazy. And he was quiet for the rest of the honeymoon. And then the very first day we were home, he's like, hey, 6 o'clock rule. We made a deal. You gave me your word. You don't go back on your word. And he turned it into this is you, the integrity of you as a person. And I was like, oh, okay. Thinking he'd forget about it. And I tried to negotiate my way out of it. I was like, how about if I have the phone until 6 on weekdays, and then on weekends I get to use the phone entirely? Or giving him another option, I have the phone all week, and I put it away the whole weekend. Imagine that. And he was like, oh, well, I'll think about it. Which is a very smart negotiation tactic. Don't actually tell them what you're thinking at the time. And he went and he bought a small silver locker. And I had to put my phone in the small silver locker at 6 p.m. every day. I do not know when we negotiated that. And that's why I'm telling you, give the person the courtesy of knowing when you're negotiating. But it was something that was a really big issue for a long time. So it's really about if you're in a relationship where the other person is a very good negotiator and you don't want to, and this happens a lot with bosses as well. A person I work with on my team is a very good negotiator, just in terms of their ability to understand, to isolate why you're doing what you're doing, and to isolate how important it is to you on a scale of things. And in those scenarios, I always say, I don't want us to negotiate right now. I want us to both sit down, be honest about what we want, and give each other a minute to go back and actually think about what we're willing to offer. Because that's a relationship I want to keep. But if it's at work, it is about diffusing as much power as possible.
You said 3% of people are good negotiators. How do you measure that? And then how do you find people, if you want on your team? How do you find the people?
The great thing about negotiation is it is a skill that is learnable. right? That's the great thing. We just don't teach it because it's never really been prioritized in the same way, you know, computer science has been. And that's going to change in these next 20 years because we know that the most marketable and important skills are those human-based skills. So negotiation, empathy, listening, those are going to be the ones that everybody's going to be looking at or is looking at. Jack Ma had actually a pretty interesting thing he said when he was talking about negotiation. He said he picked the best negotiators based on who could convince him. That was how he picked them. So he said, if I was working and I had an idea and somebody told me that's wrong and they could fundamentally convince me without me feeling like I lost, I felt like this would be a good person I could send into other meetings to negotiate on my behalf. Now, there are ways where we measure negotiation. So there's tests you can take. There's actually courses you can go into. And there's different kinds of negotiations, right? So there's multi-factor negotiations. There's also single issue negotiations. So if you're talking about ransom negotiations, you're going to want somebody who's fundamentally different, both in theory and practice, than who you want for a trade negotiation or who you want for a border negotiation or territory, right? So that's a core difference. The way we measure negotiators is based on the percentage that we can send out into the field. So, for example, negotiation is taught... Not our employees. So it wasn't measured by us. It was done by Stanford Business School. But in terms of for businesses, for multilateral institutions, what percentage of employers think that their employees could be issued out for negotiations? And it was 3%. At the UN, we have it at higher. It's 9%. But that's because negotiation is a core part of UN work. So we actively seek them out. The second thing I'll say is empathy, I think, is the most important skill. If you can get somebody who has empathy and is a good listener, they can negotiate. They can negotiate in a heartbeat. They just need to be taught the actual fundamental skills. If somebody is unempathetic, it is very difficult to teach them how to negotiate because they cannot actually hear the why. They can be the best listener in the world, but if they do not understand basic human emotion, if they don't understand that maybe this is happening because the person is scared, or the person, a very good example we have was a militia recently where the head of the militia was being very clear, in my opinion, about his why. He was saying, I can't go back to being a mechanic. I'm not going to make $300 a day. $300 a month, sorry. I said, I can't go back to being a mechanic. Who's going to respect me if I'm a mechanic, right? And he was just kept repeating that. And the translator was explaining it to the negotiator, and the negotiator was like, well, he's not answering my why. And I'm like, that's the most clear why in the world. She's like, no, he's talking about money. It's all financial to him. I'm like, but it's not. Because if you're actually listening to him, it had nothing. The $300 a month was, yeah, he makes $5 million now because he owns the ports and the airport, but that wasn't the core part. The core part is he walks into his community and he's the most respected and revered and trusted person. So it's not about giving him a job that's going to make him a lot of money. It's about saying you can maybe have a political position, or you can have a position of authority in your community, which then goes into impunity. Are you going to offer impunity to everybody that was in the militias? So it changes the entire trajectory of the negotiation if you know what the person wants. And the vast majority of the time, it is assumed that it's money, and that's why the fighting starts again within 5 years.
So, compare and contrast curiosity and empathy.
I think curiosity is wanting to know for the sake of knowing. I think empathy is wanting to know for the sake of understanding. That might be the way I define it. That curiosity is wanting to know for the sake of knowing, and empathy is wanting to know for the sake of understanding. That would be how I define it. And I don't think they're either or. It's both and, right? I gave a lot of people ideas, apparently.
Are you about to buy a silver box?
She'd be fired.
I would guess that your job does not really end at 6 o'clock on the world stage and time zones and people globally. What was the end result of that for you professionally, personally, to have your phone?
That's a very good question. I wish my husband was here so we could. No, so it was interesting. My job doesn't end. I travel about 85% of the year, and usually the people calling me are not people who do not want their phone answered, their call answered. And it's the same for me. I want that same reciprocation. So for me, a huge part of it was also managing expectations at work. It was telling my team after 6, I'm no longer on the phone. And the first couple of weeks, members from my team would show up at my house, which apparently was also a problem. But it took a minute for my team to get used to it. It was really once they got used to it that they could manage. So I've put people in place that I implicitly trust, that I send out in lieu of me. When I first started this work, now 10 years ago, I would have to be everywhere. And very quickly I learned that that is not something I wanted to do, nor was it something I was going to continue to do. So I brought on people who I could send out in my place, who would be as efficient and as effective when it came to the strategic end or the consulting end. When it came to the high level stuff, I would still go. So I would still be the one who would advise, prime ministers, et cetera, but I would not be the one to go to the Pentagon for a half-day meeting. And because I've had them, once the phone was put away, it took a learning curve for us, and they were able to pick up a lot of that. Where it's impacted my work most, I would say, is perception. So there's a perception from my colleagues, and perception is often reality. Perception, I'm the youngest high-level commissioner by almost 40 years, and I work with predominantly men. And so there's a perception from my older male colleagues that I got married and I'm slowly going into the barefoot in the kitchen scenario. Like, oh, your phone today, huh? Well, interesting. And I'm like, so I'm like, good talk, buddy. And they tell me stories about like their daughter who was an amazing lawyer, and then she got married and now she has 6 kids and she lives in Kentucky. And I'm like, oh, yeah. And so that perception has definitely shown up a lot in our conversations, where they've been like, I'll call you. Oh, no, I won't call you tonight. Your husband has your phone in a box. And I've been a bit of a jerk about it, because I go to their wives and I tell their wives about this awesome new thing that's really changed my marriage. And so now a lot of them have phones in boxes too. It's worked out great. No, but really, a lot of them do. So it worked out fantastic.
This is interesting, hearing these two spheres that you have, your personal versus sort of the professional. It's sort of sticking more perhaps to the professional side. Could you say a bit more about the difference for you between when you're negotiating essentially as a mediator versus negotiating where you're a protagonist? So I think about, for example, your work in women's reproductive rights may be very different from your work trying to help foster a peace negotiation in some other country that you're not associated with.
For sure. It is, and it isn't. So it is in the sense that my personal and emotional stake in it is different. It isn't in the way I am with whoever I'm negotiating with. I always walk in as though I'm negotiating as a mediator. Always. It does, and I actually I tell people on my team, I tell people when I train them, the more emotionally invested you are in it, the more you need to be careful about how much emotion you show. So I actually look a lot less interested in the negotiations I care the most about. Always. And it's the best way, and I try to create, what I found to be the best is oftentimes in negotiations like that, my counterpart is a lot more emotionally invested than I am, or at least is visibly so. And so I always try to create an emotional connection with them. And that helps me a lot. But if I really, truly care about something, then I do my best to be as unemotional as possible, or I should not be in that room. I think if you're a good negotiator, if you're a good anything, if you're a good leader, if you know that your personal ability is, your personal emotion is going to hinder the outcome, do not go into the room. And so there have been negotiations where I've stepped out and said, this is not for me. We had a very heated negotiation about opioid addiction, and about the fact that opioid addiction was being treated at the time as a criminal offense, and that there were a lot of people who weren't getting the necessary support, and the funding that we were negotiating was between treating and supporting opioid addicts in the long term versus a sports facility. And for me, for whatever reason, that was just the most insane thing I had ever heard. And so I was like, and I noticed myself getting emotional to the point where I was like, I cannot continue, because the more I would ask, I'd be like, yeah, but why? There was no tangible, there was nothing that I could not be like, are you kidding me? And so I stepped out. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
So if you find yourself in that situation, your advice is find a mediator.
Always. Always. And you should never go into negotiation without a mediator, right? Even if you have the ability to mediate, that's why mediators are so important. You should never go into any negotiation without a mediator. And I argue you should never assume a negotiation is over if you haven't tried the mediator route. You should never assume an argument is like done. And I have good friends who have been at the point where they're like, well, we're getting divorced or we're getting separated. And the first thing I tell them is, have you gone to a mediator? And one of them, this recently happened with somebody who's a professional negotiator. But have you gone to a mediator? No one will ever be able to mediate and negotiate at the same time. Because when you go in as a negotiator, you always do want something. You can be cordial about it, you can be unemotional about it, but your end game is an end game, right? And so you're never going to show your cards. You're never going to be as transparent as you need to be. And the job of a mediator is to be so transparent and open and welcoming and trusting that they create an environment where both negotiators feel comfortable. So there are two different jobs. You always, in my opinion, you should always have a good mediator.
So that means you're the mediator, you said, and somebody else, they're too far. You're always in the middle. Is that what you're saying?
I've
You don't play both roles. You don't play, I know what I want, and I'm playing dual person, which is I'm going to mediate, and my mindset is there, and I'm going to empathize, I'm going to listen, I'm going to ask questions. I know what I really want, but I'm going to stay in the middle, and I'm going to play two roles at the same time.
So I have mediated before, but no, I'm a negotiator. I'm a lead negotiator, and I do that. So I still, as a lead negotiator, you're never going to, more often than not, you're not going to go in and say, listen, our benchmark is 80%, and if we don't get 80%, we're walking away. That's not ever how you start in a negotiation. You'll go in and you'll say, so why is this important to you? And you'll begin to have a conversation. Oftentimes, your negotiations will last quite a long time. Sometimes they'll be very short, right? And so in peace processes and things like that, you have a lot more leeway. You have months. You get to sit with each other for a week, and then you both go back to separate countries, and you get to come back. And you have months and years, actually, to create a relationship with your counterpart. Whereas in some negotiations, you're there literally for an afternoon. And so you choose the speed and tempo, but the main thing you want to do, yes, is empathize and listen and create a relationship where the person trusts you so that they actually want to talk to you. Because if they don't trust you, then they're never going to tell you what they want, and you're never going to be able to meet somewhere 2/3 or in the middle of the way.
Is there a preset time frame as to when you would want to have someone negotiate by, or is it just kind of like, we'll get there when we get there?
Well, usually so it depends on the kind of negotiation. If you have something like a ransom negotiation, it's you'll get there hopefully in time. If you have, that's the fairest statement I can give. If you have something like a peace process, an agenda is set before you ever sit down. So before people ever sit at the same table, mediators, lead negotiators from each side will say, these are our terms for us to sit. This is what we have to negotiate. So if I give you the Colombia peace process as an example, it was we have to be able to negotiate victims' rights, reparations, land ownership, political engagement, et cetera. And there was a time frame set out for that. That took 2 years on its own. Creating the agenda backdoor with President Santos took 2 years before anybody sat down for an official negotiation. So it's a process. It's to be able to gain the trust and to get people to sit down, especially in conflict settings, is the most difficult. And we were brought in pretty recently by a political party here in the States to measure, without giving this away too much, to measure what they felt was the appetite for their candidate in a particular region. And so my team was meant to go in and do an assessment. And my team, I didn't send in negotiators. I didn't send in, because they were told they were going to go do an assessment. So I sent in researchers. And they came out and they were like, we're never doing that again. And I was like, why? And they were like, they kept negotiating with us. They kept being like, well, why do you want to know this? What's going on? Who do you work for? If you tell us, we'll tell you. And she was like, that's not my job. I just research. I just ask people, I give people surveys and they're supposed to answer them. And these people were highly suspicious. And so the very first thing we said was, in any research, even academic, you have to be able to gain trust, right? Negotiation is very much the same, except in negotiation, you're actively asking the other person for something. Even if you haven't asked them yet, they know it's coming by nature of you both being there, right? So you imagine that on steroids, right? Like if I'm coming and asking you, why are you voting for a political party? And we're sitting in an active negotiation, at some point, my question, my ask for you is going to be related to that. So you become a lot more guarded. It takes a lot more time.
Can you talk a little about what happened in Colombia? Because after everything was negotiated, then the country had such a backlash against it. What was the ultimate outcome?
Well, it wasn't such a backlash. It was like 1%. So the referendum, yeah. So one of the biggest challenges, and that was something that was actually heavily debated, which many of us disagreed with, but the belief was, looking at the statistics on successful negotiations, President Santos, who was the president of Colombia at the time, said, listen, if this is going to work, everybody has to be on board. And that was spurned a lot by the political sentiment in the country. A former head of state had been very vocally against the peace process. And the peace process has touched the conflict, is a 70-year conflict. So it's touched every family, everybody's been impacted, and there is a very strong urban-rural divide in the sentiments around the FARC and the paramilitary groups, et cetera. And so he said we should take it to a referendum. And they lost the referendum, and within five to 6 months after that, they ended up passing it through Parliament. So we didn't do a second referendum or anything like that. So it still went through. It was still resourced. I think the biggest challenge, we can get into this is getting into a bit of a political conversation, which we can do, that's fine too, but the biggest challenge I think globally is is a rise, not necessarily only in populism, but also a rise in direct democracy, an assumption of direct democracy without an understanding of your actual civil responsibilities, right? Your civic responsibilities. And so one of the biggest challenges in Colombia was an assumption of direct democracy without the understanding of civic responsibility. So a lot of people hadn't read the peace process. A lot of people actually didn't know what was in it, similar to a lot of other votes we've had. Exactly.
What was the book you referenced that your friend used during her salary negotiations?
Let me actually give you the proper name. It is Roger Fisher's Getting to Yes and Chris Voss's Never Split the Difference. So Chris Voss is a famous ransom negotiator. I don't agree with everything he says in his book. I will flag that for you because it is very specific to hostage and ransom negotiations, which are, as I said, fundamentally different than other kinds of negotiations. But I actually do think he does pretty well in explaining a lot of the core components. Has anybody read either of those books? Yeah?
Interesting read.
Yeah?
Make sure you have your radio voice.
My radio voice?
Boss says that you have a
Oh, yeah.
radio voice.
Yeah. So I'll tell you something. This is actually kind of a funny joke about, well, I don't know if it's funny. That's probably an insensitive thing to say. About hostage negotiation. So we were having an active training on hostage negotiation, and as we were doing the training, a scenario happened. This was in LA, and our negotiator, Chris Voss was one of them, got called out. And they were running out, and they're like, we have to take this, and everyone's really serious. And they get into the car, and they're like, you guys can come. There were 6 of us. They're like, you guys can come to watch, to observe firsthand. I was 23 or 24 at the time. This was my first, real heated, training that wasn't a peace process. Peace processes are a lot slower. They're a lot more, So I was like, this is insane, and I was, running with them. And we got there, and then he got on, the phone, and the guy was talking to him, and he's, this is what I demand. And Chris goes, well, okay, that's doable. And the guy's like, okay. And that was it. It was literally 10 minutes. And I was like, what? And we had been in class with him for 2 days. I was like, really, is this what you're training? I could have done that before I met you. So yeah. But that's my funny hostage story. Everyone was alive, so it was fine.
If you were asked to advise on what's going on in Venezuela, what sort of suggestions would you have?
So we're actually working on Venezuela. I think one of the biggest challenges in Venezuela is and Venezuela is not unique in this, but there is a lot of regional instability that Venezuela is not necessarily responsible for, but definitely tapping into, right? So historically, Colombians have gone to Venezuela as migrants and refugees, and now it's happening in the inverse. So that's something that is not necessarily being supported by their neighboring countries. When you match that with the internal challenges, it's very difficult to find the necessary regional support to be able to help stabilize the country. We do not think that Venezuela will be an internal solution. We don't. We don't think it's internal alone. It does not matter how the government changes. It doesn't. In terms of damage, it would take a minimum of 2 generations to be able to get people back to the level of affluence and comfort. You're looking at the highest level of drought you've ever had. I'm losing my English. Starvation, sorry, that you've ever had in the country. You are looking at the highest levels of poverty as well, but it's starvation. It's those long-term psychological and health issues that are the most deteriorative, right? Because at the end of the day, it's a resource-rich country. It is a country that, when organized and when properly managed, is not in need of financial support. It's not in need of political support. The challenge really is creating that necessary toolkit, and we can't without regional support, and there is not a lot of regional support at all. The second issue with Venezuela is similar to DRC, in the sense that when you do have such resource-rich countries that do not have that regional stability to support them, there is an assumption that international support is necessary. And the problem here is a history of international disillusionment. And so any type of international engagement is seen as being imperial or overstepping. And that limits our toolbox, as you can expect, quite a bit. So Venezuela is a very, very tough question. I don't think anybody has the answer. I do think we are going to see it deteriorate more, for sure.
Same question for Brexit.
Brexit's tough. So Brexit's very tough. Brexit is, I think, the best example of when direct democracy doesn't make sense, in my opinion. I think Brexit is also an example of listening to the lowest common denominator. So David Cameron made a mistake in the sense that he really did want to appease. And so I think that's a failure of leadership at its core. The biggest challenge about Brexit, though, is it's gotten so far in that I don't see it being challenged in a significant way. I do think there could potentially be a no-deal Brexit. I think with Boris, it will actually be a much worse Brexit. And I think the fact that the Brexit Party, which I think is the funniest irony in the world, the Brexit Party won the most EU votes. I think it's fantastic. I was like, because when somebody told me that, they were like, no, I was in Brussels, they were like, yeah, Brexit won the most. And I was like, what? Aren't they leaving? So I think it's pretty interesting that a huge part of the conversation that's happening in the UK now is how do we maintain a lot of our privilege without being part of that instrument? And my biggest worry for Brexit isn't the UK at this point, but it's actually Italy and its other major players within the EU, because there are 4 major EU countries that really do control about 80% of the budget, more than 80% of the decision making. And there's that increasing sentiment in all of them, and I think Italy is the one that's closest to being a worry. And so Brexit, the UK at this point, I think politically is a bit of a, in that sense, a write-off. I think Italy is the worry.
What are some of the things that they didn't do over the past few years that had they done them, we'd be in a different position?
Well, I think first and foremost, the same thing that happens in the U.S. often is an underestimation of your opponent. I don't think they understood quite. I don't think they were quite aware of the reasons, the why, for a lot of people's grief. So if you remember when they were campaigning for Brexit, the Brexit group was campaigning on immigration, and it was campaigning on finances, and it was saying, listen, these migrants are coming to take your jobs. And it was tapping into a lot of the fear that propelled a lot of people, whereas the Stay were like, no, the NHS is good. Like, they were having 2 fundamentally different conversations. And so in the States, we've had a similar thing happen where at some point you have to be able to fight fire with fire, and you have to be able to actually take away the power from someone's claims. And the unwillingness to do that actually just strengthens them. So I think the biggest thing in Brexit was the inability to actually take away from a lot of the Leave claims. And to disprove them, and to actually be like, no, this isn't about immigration. And a huge part of it, there's a very famous saying by Martin Luther King Jr. about how liberals are actually the biggest enemy. And not to say liberals are, but I do think there's a lot of truth in the fact that a huge part of our inability to talk about issues that really matter and shape politics is our belief in our own values and morals. So a lot of liberals in England were like, we're not going to talk about migration because that's not an issue. Of course it's not an issue, when it was actually probably the defining issue of that referendum, right? And so it's an inability to admit maybe we are more xenophobic than we think we are. Maybe we are more racist than, maybe we are more, but let's talk about this. Let's lay it out so that it takes away a lot of that power and ammunition.
The token
is, I think I mentioned, because you must come across this in other settings, what we now realise is there was a coalition of at least 5 different reasons why different populations wanted to leave. There was only really one reason to stay, and the Remainers didn't get that they were dealing with 5 different, or 6 or 4, whatever it is, very fundamentally different values and mindsets about why people were voting to leave.
And all emotional.
They had power,
Yeah.
even though they don't really agree with each other either.
Yeah.
You must come across that in these complex international...
All the time. And with Brexit in particular, they were all overwhelmingly emotional on the leave end. And the argument on the stay was very theoretical. It was very practical. It was, let's show you budgets. So they weren't speaking the same language to people. People were feeling very like wound up on this side, and then they would come here and be like, tell us the answers. And they'd be like, well, 320 million comes from the EU for this budget. And so it was a complete, for people, it was a complete disconnect. And there's, I think one of the reassuring things about Brexit, and one of the reassuring things globally, because this has turned into a really sad assessment of world politics at this point, is that the younger generation votes overwhelmingly to stay.
But 52% of British voters are not xenophobes, maybe 20%.
Oh, I agree. But I don't think, I don't think 52% are. But what we have to be honest about is its ability to drive emotion and its ability to drive fear. I think 52% of British voters are scared. Scared of A, B, C, or D, but they're scared of something. And the inability for the Stay campaign to address fear was, I would argue, the reason they lost. You can't address fear with budgets and spreadsheets.
Any thought on the Mueller's report?
On the Mueller report? Mueller?
Because we talk about Brexit a lot, but
Yeah.
the United States.
I have a quick question, a show of hands, out of curiosity. How many people here have read the Mueller report? One person? One? 2 people. The whole report. No, all 480 pages. Yeah? 2 people. Okay. Have you read the Mueller report?
It's in my to-do list.
Okay.
This is one thing.
Yeah, right. That was my one thing.
Do you have an opinion on it? That's the wrong answer. If you haven't read the report, it's the wrong answer.
Well, my question was because I haven't read it.
Oh, so you want the cheat sheet?
So you're a doctor, right?
Yes.
MD?
Yeah, MD. No, I'm a real doctor. All the PhDs here are going to fight me, but it's okay.
Used to say MD much deeper and PhD pile high and deeper.
Exactly. Well, my dad jokes. He's like, oh, you're the kind of doctor they want on the plane. So.
So if you practice medicine, or are you practicing?
I did pediatric surgery, and I still maintain it in the summers for my license. Yeah. 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 So I operate on kids because they don't talk back when they're sedated. They can't. No. Oh. Oh, not if they're sedated. But the parents. So nobody, when I went into peds, nobody warned me about the parents. When I was doing my internship, the parents were delightful because they were mean to the doctor, but they were delightful to me because I was like their sidekick and getting them things. So they'd be like, and then the doctor would come in and they'd be like, well, that guy, what's he saying? Can you translate for me? And I felt so like wonderful because I was, better than the doctor. And then I became the doctor. And they'd be to my interns, they'd be like, well, what's she saying? Can you translate for me? And I'm like, hey, I know what you're doing. So no, the parents are tough negotiators in peds. Very tough. Any last questions?
Yeah, you said you never bring no to the negotiating table, but there's the takeaway. I've seen work successfully in some real estate negotiations over the years. Do you ever use that in any situation? Successfully?
The one thing I've used successfully when it comes to actually being is to pretend to walk away, if that makes sense. So to be like, if it gets to a point where you're clearly not making progress and it's really dependent on the negotiation you're in, I'll say, well, clearly we don't have an agreement here and you can walk away. That works best in trade negotiations. If there are lives on the line, we tend not to do that. We'll compromise at almost any cost. But if it's a trade negotiation or if it's a personal negotiation, which tells you where that falls, I'm like, well, clearly we're not going to agree, and you walk away. And usually the person, the best example I was given from this is actually from an old mentor of mine who said, you know, when you're online shopping and you close the browser, sometimes you like see the shipping cost or whatever it is, but you close the browser. And then the next day in your email, you get, oh, you left things in your cart, 20% off. Yeah. And so his advice to me was always, when you're shopping online, close the browser, come back. And when you're negotiating and you can't get somewhere and you know the person will always come back, walk away. Because they're more likely to say, hey, you know what we were talking about yesterday? Can we, maybe we can meet here, right? And so that's been pretty helpful, but again, very specific. And you have to know the negotiation you're in, and you have to know the other person's red lines. Because if they're not equally invested in a solution and you walk away, then A, it's going to be a lot more difficult to get back to the table with anybody else from their team. But B, that's probably going to be a loss that you have to. And one of the important things is, and I think this is probably advice that, this is from Voss's book, but and it's been helpful in some ways, and it can kind of give you an ego in others. But overall, I think the benefits outweigh the negatives, which is never be willing to negotiate something you aren't willing to lose. So you have to be willing to walk away from everything. That's easier said than done, because if you are in negotiations where people are relying on you for their life, you definitely will feel differently about that. And in those cases, I highly recommend mediation and people who can actually try to keep you at the table. But again, in most negotiations, you have to be prepared to walk away with absolutely nothing. Yeah, and not beat yourself up about it.
I have just a question on how to deal with how to negotiate when big egos are involved. So I'm young.
All the time?
Younger. Sometimes I'm trying to get a client and they might be a business person with 50 years of experience. And so I feel like they need to win somehow in that negotiation. So do you have any top tips of how I can set things up so that they can feel like they won, so that we can get to a resolution?
So that's actually a very, very good question. Most people you're going to negotiate with are going to need to feel like they've won. Right? It doesn't matter if they have 50 years experience or 5 years experience. People like winning. People like knowing that especially if they're negotiating something that their boss knows about, or they have to go back, it's a real estate deal, or something that they can tangibly close. It is a loss if they don't get it, right? It's as simple as that. And there's not as much space in the middle. So people always need to feel like they win. The one thing you should never be is disingenuous. So I've been in negotiations where the other person will be like, you're so smart. I wish I had thought of it like that. And you sit there and you're like, do you think I'm fresh to this? Like, I know you're trying to make me, to kind of soothe my ego. It makes the other person even more suspicious, right? So I think being honest, being genuine, and if it is something of you have 50 years experience, you can mention, look at the work they've done before. The number one thing I have to say in any negotiation is do your research. If you know who you're sitting across, and this is, sometimes you don't. If you're in a hostage, you will never know, right? But if you do know, leverage your research. If this person has worked for 50 years and you've seen some of the work they've done and you see what their proudest moments are, you can even ask, what are the things in your 50-year career you're most proud of? And it might be something that falls perfectly in line with your solution, right? And you can say, if we do this together, then this is something else that you can add to your legacy, et cetera, et cetera. So there's ways, there's always alternative wins. And a good example here is for the Iran deal that Obama put together. A huge part of that win wasn't internal. It wasn't national, right? There was a lot of fallout nationally. But it was a huge part of that Obama legacy. And so his need, his desire, his team's desire to complete that negotiation wasn't entirely about Iran and the US. It wasn't, those were metrics, but the real aspect of it, the crux of it, and the same thing with Cuba, were about legacy, right? And so usually you can leverage different parts of somebody's character, personality, or needs in a negotiation. You just have to know what they are, and the only way you know that is by listening. So be upfront, be honest, say, I'm really, happy that you and I are having the chance to do this. I've respected your career for a long time. And try to be a person before you are a competitor. Any last questions?
I really like the example of Brexit that you used earlier in terms of being, a coalition coalition that forms around a central result, but they all have different interests in getting into it. And when you're in a negotiation under that style, when you're fighting multiple people that have multiple needs, what do you tend to focus on? And like, what's most important to you in that?
So there's two schools of thought. There's the divide and conquer school of thought, which I actually think doesn't work, not as effectively in the long term, because in today's world, you can only divide people for so long, and then they'll be like, wait a second, you and I still agree on what we wanted. And so that tends not to work in the long term. What I do think works effectively is even within that coalition, there are the loudest or most powerful voices, right? Or, and this is something that's especially true for political negotiations, where's the money coming from? Those are kind of where you begin to weigh like, oh, wait a second, maybe these are the voices that we need to speak to first. The challenge is if you can get 2 or 3 people, 2 or 3 groups within that coalition to agree with you, it's a lot easier to get the other 2, but you have to pick the right ones. So I'll give you a conflict example. Or I'll try to actually give you a political example because conflict is a bit more difficult. So we recently were brought into a local city. This is going to sound very small time, but my team was asked to come and consult in a local city where a lot of the senior citizens lived in a neighborhood that they have built over 20, 30 years, right? So it's been made accessible for them. They've really reinvested into their community. And the city is growing very quickly. A lot of young families are moving in, and the young families like that neighborhood. They would like to live there. It has the lowest crime rates. It is the nicest. It has very good, apparently, indoor pools and malls, So younger families want that neighborhood, and senior citizens were like, no. Our tax dollars have gone to this city. We've built this. This is disrespectful to us. We don't like the noise levels. We do not want an elementary school here. This isn't how, we don't like that so many buses are coming. And it really came to a head where those 2 groups were having a lot of trouble with each other. And a third party, of some of which were city representatives, some of which were local business people, but different groups really actually wanted the young families to stay. They did not want the young families to feel discouraged from staying. They wanted them there. There are higher property taxes, so the city would end up making more money. Businesses end up getting more profit because a lot of businesses were there. So those groups, for different reasons, wanted the young families to stay. And what we saw really quickly was the young families be approached by them. Media begin to strengthen that message, a really quick organization almost of these very different parts that previously had never really connected. And what our team did to begin to understand, because we were actually asked in by one of the senior citizens. That's how we had been invited in, and then the city followed up commissioning us. And what was the most interesting was looking at where a lot of the resources came from. It came from one big business coalition. So for us, the important group to talk to wasn't the young families, and it wasn't the senior citizens. It was the business coalition. It was saying, okay, what is your interest here? Because a lot of what was driving the media messaging and now the public sentiment and a lot of young families that weren't really invested previously was all this money that was coming in that was telling them, this is your right, this is where you belong, senior citizens shouldn't have this place, this is for you, how about your children? So the messaging had gotten a lot stronger. And it was after speaking with them and understanding their needs that you could actually bring everybody else to the table. So it really is about, in my opinion, in many cases, it's about finding who has the most power, and that can either be resources or information. All right, thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you.